Hi guys, welcome back to Kids for Code. So today we are going to be doing more Java Advanced and we're going to be learning about arrays and functions. So we did a little bit about functions before, but we're really going to do a lot more and we're going to totally start brand new with arrays. But first we have a few review questions from last time. We left you with two, and the first one says, what will happen if we do int num equals random dot next int? And notice that this is random dot next int with no numbers inside of the parentheses. So if you put no numbers inside of the parentheses, that means that a random integer is going to be generated out of all integers that Java allows. And as you can see here, that's a really big number. So we never want to do this really, because since when are we ever going to use a number that's going to be this big? So always make sure that we put numbers inside of the parentheses and that we follow those rules that we learned last time. Our second question is, why do we use functions? And this is really important. Functions organize our code. They keep us from repeating the same code over and over again, and it's easier for us to make changes and fix bugs. For example, if there's something wrong with one function, you don't have to change that same code in every single place you use it. You can just change the code in that one function. So now let's get into what are arrays and why we're going to use them. So arrays hold data and allow us to organize our variables together. So we can organize these related variables together in one variable. And that might sound kind of complicated, but after we get into it more, it's going to be pretty easy for us. So if we want to keep track of many phone numbers, names, addresses, we would have to use a ton of variables. That's going to be really hard to keep track of. Separate variables, if you want to make a change to all of them, it's going to take forever. So now we can just use one array that'll store all data of one type. So for example, if we wanted to store data like a ton of names, we can just use an array of strings. So let's go inside arrays. Arrays are a lot of storage spaces, and each of these little storage spaces, boxes, they're called indexes. And each index is numbered starting from 0. So every array will store only one type of data. So for example, this one's going to store integers. And in the index 0, it's going to store the value 3. The numbers in red are the number index, and the numbers inside of the boxes are what is inside of that index, what's inside of that little storage box. So each box can hold one piece of data. So for example, boxes 0 and 1 hold integers 3 and 5. And as we can see here, if a box does not have any data yet, it'll have a default value. And each data type has a different default value. So if you don't set anything, if you don't set indexes 2, 3, or 4 equal to anything in an array of integers, it's going to default to 0. Same thing with doubles. Booleans will default to false, and objects like strings will default to null. We'll talk a little bit more about null and what that is, and also exactly what objects are. Right now, we've kind of just learned that strings are objects, but we're going to go into that more next lesson. So here we have making arrays in Java, how we're going to do it. So here's an example. Int, and then 2 square brackets, my array, which is just the name of the array, and then equals new int square brackets, and then 5. So the 5 here is the length of the array. So for example, in this one, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 boxes, that means the length is 5. But notice that the numbers don't go to 5. The index numbers don't go to 5 because we start counting from 0. So it's just going to go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's our array of size or length 5. So here's another way we can make arrays. Int, the same brackets, name of the array, and then curly bracket with numbers or whatever value you want. It doesn't have to be numbers, but since this is a int array, we need to have numbers with commas separating them. This will automatically make an array of size 3 with values 1, 2, 3 in that order. If we use this one, it's not going to have anything inside of the array yet. It's just going to create the array with size 5. So all the indexes, all the uh, boxes will be empty, and it'll be 0, since that's the default value for integer arrays. So a little bit more about making arrays. So let's notice that the format for making new arrays is the exact same as making other variables. So before we did stuff like int num equals 1, string name equals John, scanner keyboard equals new scanner system.in. It all follows the same format, which is data type first, name, and what we want to initialize the variable to. So the data type for this is integer array. So we're going to do integer and then the 2 square brackets, which means arrays. And then we have the name. This one's going to be called nums. And then what we're setting it equal to. So we're setting it equal to a new integer array because of the square brackets, and then of size 3. We're going to put the length inside of the square brackets. So let's get some practice with this in Eclipse. So over here, I have an Eclipse class open called Arrays Demo. You guys can follow along with me. I'm going to make a new integer array of size 3. So right now, I'm going to do my int because I want to make an integer array. Don't forget, I need the square brackets because square brackets means arrays. Then I'm going to name it. I'm going to name this one nums because it's going to be full of numbers. I'm going to set it equal to what we want to initialize this variable to. I want to make it a new integer array, and I want it to have size 3. So this is how we can make an array of size 3 for integers. Now let's practice making one for strings. So now I can go string. Make sure you have the capital S. In Java, the S will always be capital. Then the brackets because of arrays. Then I'm going to call this one names is equal to new string array. So I need the bracket again because it's arrays. And then let's say I want to make it size 10 because I have 10 names that I want to remember. And there we go. So you can do this for any data type that we've learned. You can do this for integers, doubles, Boolean strings, and any data type that there is. So let's go back to our slides. So we've done this one, and now we're going to go over navigating arrays and accessing values. So now that we're able to store our information, we have to access them somehow so we can use the values. Access just means how are we going to get them? So another thing I want to go over is the data that's in each box is called an element. So the blue numbers here are elements, and the red numbers are the index numbers. So for example, the first element is 1, but the first index number is 0 in this example here. So over here, I have an example of an array we made, my array, and it has the numbers 1, 2, 3 pictured here. The way we're going to get the values that are inside of this array is with the index numbers. And we're going to put the index number in between 2 square brackets. So for example, if I wanted the number in the 0 index, I'm going to do this, go to my array, 0, and then 1. So if I print this out, 1 is going to be printed out. What if I wanted to get the number 2 for my array? So I need to know where 2 is in my array. And I'm going to look at my picture here. I have the number 2 in the index number 1. So if I want to get that, I need to do the name of my array. This one's called my array. And I'm going to put the index number in between 2 square brackets. If I print this out, it's going to print out 2. So let's go over some array tips. As we said before, each box or storage space in an array is called an index, and all arrays have that specific length that we did when we initialized it and we put the number in between the 2 square brackets. So I have another array here. This one is size or length 3. And in this example, the array has a length of 3, so it has 3 indexes. But notice that it doesn't have an index number 3. It only has indexes 0 to 2, because we're going to start counting from 0. So 0, 1, and 2, that's 3 elements. That's a size or length 3. So this is what our array looks like. But what if we want to get the index number 3? Well, that's not going to work. So we cannot go past index 3 in our array because we made an array with length 3 with only indexes 0, 1, and 2. It doesn't have index 3. So if we ever try to go past index 2, for example, array 3 in the brackets equals 5, we want to try to set that third index to 5. It's not going to work. We're going to get something called an array out of bounds exception. And an exception is just something that will stop your program from running. It's similar to the red lines we have in Eclipse, but the tricky thing with exceptions is it's not going to appear in red lines because it's not going to happen until the program executes. Once we try to execute this line, array with 3 in it, Eclipse is going to go over here and see that the array ends at 2, index 2. It doesn't have 3. So it's going to throw this array out of bounds exception, and the program is going to stop. We cannot have any of these exceptions because that means our program is not going to work. So we always really need to be careful. Let's go back to Eclipse, and I'm going to go through a few more examples. So over here, I have my arrays. I'm going to do the nums one for now. And let's say I want to set it equal to some numbers. So remember, this is one way we can initialize an array with just this new int3. But if I try to get index 0, what do you guys think is going to print out? It's going to print out 0 because this only creates this new array. Every box is empty. And when it's empty, it's going to default to the default value of that data type. And if we remember before, the default value of ints is 0. If we try to do Booleans, and then I try to get index 0, it's going to print out false. So now I'm going to do that other initialization trick we learned before. Instead of setting it to new int, which is going to create an empty array, we can set it equal to some values with curly brackets. So let's say I want an array of integers, and it's going to have the values 2, 4, 1, and 6. Now, if we want to get the numbers that are in here, remember we have to use these square brackets. We're going to use the name of the array and then the square brackets with the number index we want. Let's say I want the second number. So you might think, okay, I want the second number. I'm going to put 2, right? Well, let's see what happens. We want the second number, which is 4. But it's going to print out 1. And why is that? Because this is not the second number. This is index 2. And as we remember, indexes start with 0. So let's count this. 0, 1, 2. So if I do nums 2, it's going to go to the second index, not the second index, index 2, and it's going to get 1. So if we want the second number, we're going to have to use 1 in this example, which is going to print out 4. Now, another thing I want to go over is changing the values in an array. So for example, nums 1 is equal, I can set it to any number I want. If I want to set this to 10, it's now going to print out 10 for what nums1 equals. So let's go back to our slides. And we have an example here of using a for loop to navigate through an array. So when we use a for loop to navigate through an array, we got to remember those bounds that we learned before with the condition. It's really important that we get the right condition, or else we're going to get an array out of bounds exception. So for example, I'm going to make a for loop right now. I'm going to start I equals 0, and this for loop is going to print out all numbers in the array. I should say that first. I equals 0, because I want to print index 0 first, since arrays start with 0 as their index. We're going to come back to the condition, and I want to go change one at a time. I want to go one by one and print out every number in here. So one way we could do that's technically right is going I is less than 4. So as we can see here, when it's going through this array, it's gonna go to 0, print that out, 1, print that out, 2, print that out, 3, print that out. And then when I equals to 4, we're not going to enter because 4 is not less than 4. So that's all we're going to print out, and that's perfect. But the thing is that what if we don't always know the length of our array? So we can't always hard code it, which means we're just going to put the number in there. We should always use nums.length. This dot length is going to return the length of the array, even after we've made it. So this has 1, 2, 3, 4 numbers. The numbers dot length is going to be equal to 4. So this is also going to work if we have our print statement in here. And we're going to use nums and then I for the index, because we're going to go to index 0, index 1, index 2, index 3. And let's test this out to make sure we got it correct. And yep, 2416. So let's go to the functions now. We're through the arrays. And one thing that we didn't go over before really are function parameters. So before, if you remember, we talked about creating functions. And now we're going to talk about parameters, which are the numbers that you see in these parentheses here. And it's going to pass the values over here into this function. So why do we even need to pass numbers in? Can't we just make variables and then they can use the variables in here? Well, no, because functions don't have access to the variables created in other functions. So let's look at this in Eclipse. I have a demo here called functions demo 1. And we have a function here called print sum. So as we remember, if we want to call a function, we're just going to have the name, and then in the parentheses, put the values we want. So for the functions in this class, we're always just going to have public. We're always going to have static. And then this is the return type. We're going to go through this before. We're going to go through this later, but just know that this one's void because we're not returning anything. Then this is the name, print sum, and these are the parameters we were just talking about. So in here, we have 2 integer parameters. That means that whenever we call this function, for example, in here, we need to put 2 integers inside of the parentheses. And you can put in the parentheses variables that hold integers, or you can just put in the integer itself. So this one's called print sum because it's going to take 2 integer parameters and then print out the sum. So for example, let's run this. And we have 3 and 5. It's going to print out 3 plus 5 equals 8. So let's try this. Why do we even need parameters? Let's try to do int number 1 equals 3, int number 2 equals 5. So it's created this successfully. And now let's go over here. Let's try to use these variables that we made over there so that we don't even need parameters. But as we can see here, it's not going to work because different functions cannot use different variables from other functions. And this main counts. So over here, it's not going to let us access number one and number two. These variables are called local. That means that they're only going to be inside of this function, nowhere else. That's why we need parameters for different functions. So now let's go back to our slides. And we just did this example with the print sum. And now let's go over some returning data with functions. So functions can return data. That means where a function is called, a value will be replaced with the function call. So another way to say this is the function that you call is going to send back a value. And that value we're going to specify with the return type that we just talked about. So to return data in a function, we have to tell Java the type of data we will return, and then use the return keyword in the function body. We're going to go over this in Eclipse in a second, but let's keep reading. The return keyword can be used in any function. So with a function that returns data, like int, string, boolean, double anything, we can do return my data, and my data is the name of the variable that you want to return, and you don't have to return a variable. You can just do return 3, but then it's always just going to return 3. So with a function that doesn't return data, which is void, and that's what we saw in the last example, we can just write return, and the program will continue from the line after the function was called. So in other words, if we just put return, it's going to quit that function and then go back to the place that the function was called. So let's look at this a bit in Eclipse. I also have a slide on it here. So in this example, the function return sum will evaluate to the sum of its two parameters. So for example, if you pass in 3 and 4, it's going to add them and then return the sum. The sum is going to be 4 plus 3, and it's going to print out 7. So I have this example in Eclipse 2 that we're going to look at. So I have a few different numbers, but that's okay. So for I have sum 1, and sum 1 is going to be equal to the find sum of 2 and 3. So over here, the function call is here. Once we see that function name, we're going to jump to the function of that name. And then we have our parameters here. The parameters for this function are 2 and 3. So when we call this function, num1 is equal to 2 because it's in the same spot as 2. And num2 is equal to 3 because it's the same spot as 3. So it's going to return num1 plus num2. Notice that I didn't have to make a separate variable for sum, even though I can totally do that, that's fine. I just directly put num1 plus num2 on the return line because that'll just save us some space. So it's going to return num1 plus num2 because num1 plus num2 is an int. And over here it's int. If I change this to Boolean, we're going to have an issue because num1 plus num2 isn't a Boolean, it's an int. This is not going to work. If I do return num1 equals 0, that's going to work because num1 equals 0 is a Boolean. It's going to evaluate to true or false. But for this example, we want it to be an integer. And then over here, it's going to return num1 plus num2, and that's going to replace the value of this function call. So in other words, we're going to send back what num1 plus num2 is to over here, and we're going to set sum1 equal to that. So in this example, sum1 should equal 5, and sum2 should equal 8. Let's see if we're correct. The sums are 5 and 8. Yep. So another thing I want to show is that the parameters have to be the same type as this. If I try to pass in false, it's not going to work. We're going to have that red line because there's no function that exists that's taking in an integer and a Boolean. So I'm going to have to change this back to an integer because this function is taking two integers. So let's go back to our slides. We're almost done. And we just have some summary questions left. So we're not going to answer the summary questions in this class, but we're going to answer it at the start of our next class. So maybe write it down or just think about it. But our questions are posted here. You guys can pause it and go through them. But that's the end of all of our new stuff for today. I hope you guys watch our next video, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.